In the late 18th century, a Grand Duchess looked at this painting and decided it was too much for the palace. Not too political, not too heretical, too physical. The canvas was pushed away from public view, not because Florence had never seen violence, but because this violence looked as if it understood exactly how a body dies. Today, that canvas hangs in Hall 90 of the Uffizi, right next to Caravaggio. At first glance, you're watching a biblical execution. Two women are cutting off a man's head. The scene is brutal, close, physical. There is blood everywhere. The man, Holofernes, the Assyrian general, is enormous, muscular, thrashing. His fist has blindly seized the collar of one woman's dress in a last, desperate attempt to survive. The women are not flinching. They are not praying. They are not even particularly angry. They are simply doing the work. That absence of emotion is the first thing that doesn't fit. In the entire history of this biblical subject, and dozens of painters tackled it, Judith is almost always portrayed with some visible internal conflict. A grimace, a prayer, a sideways glance toward heaven. Some acknowledgement that what she is doing costs her something. Here, there is nothing like that. Two women, a sword, a job in progress. Florence had plenty of paintings showing massacres, martyrdoms, and executions. Churches were full of them. Viewers were not squeamish people. So what exactly was so unbearable about this particular canvas? We'll come back to that. Because there is something hidden in this painting that the Duchess and nearly every art historian for 300 years completely missed. The woman holding the sword is Judith. The Book of Judith already gave painters everything they needed: deception, seduction, wine, murder, salvation. But it also gave them a safe explanation. Judith did not act alone. God guided her hand. She entered the tent of the enemy general, waited for him to lose consciousness, and cut off his head. Not because she was capable of it, but because something larger than her was moving through her body. That was the deal. You get the heroism, but you give the credit upward. And artists had been honoring that deal for centuries before Artemisia Gentileschi put brush to canvas around 1620. Donatello sculpted it. Botticelli painted it. Caravaggio painted it. In their versions, Judith stands at arm's length, looking slightly disgusted, her face turned away from the mess. She is a symbol, an allegory. Virtue defeating vice. The church defeating heresy. A woman accomplishing something superhuman precisely because it seems impossible for a woman's body to do it. Artemisia's Judith is not at arm's length. She is leaning in. Her entire weight is bearing down. Her forearm muscles are taut in a way that art historians in the 19th century simply refused to attribute to a woman painter. They assumed the canvas must have been made by Caravaggio himself, or by Artemisia's father, Orazio. That assumption stayed in the Uffizi's inventory records for almost a century. The painting was listed as the work of a man. It wasn't until 1916, when the Italian critic Roberto Longhi published his essay Gentileschi, Padre e Figlia, that authorship was formally restored to Artemisia. Longhi described what he saw as, and I'm translating loosely here, bestial impassivity. He meant it almost admiringly. Her face is almost worse than anger. The mouth is closed. The brow is steady. She is not performing violence for the viewer. She is measuring it, the way a surgeon measures an incision. That is more frightening than rage. And that, I think, is exactly why the Duchess had to get it out of her house. The revenge story is almost too convenient, and the painting itself refuses to cooperate with it. Everyone who talks about this canvas says the same thing. Artemisia painted her own face on Judith, and the face of Agostino Tassi on Holofernes. Tassi was a colleague of her father's, a perspective painter, technically brilliant, socially connected. In the spring of 1611, when Artemisia was 17, he assaulted her in her own home. A trial followed in 1612. It was public, humiliating, and decided less by the facts than by the patriarchal standards of the Roman court, where the victim's honor was as much on trial as the perpetrator's crime. Tassi was found guilty and sentenced to exile. He never served it. He had friends in the Vatican. So the story writes itself, doesn't it? Traumatized young artist takes her revenge on canvas. She paints his face on the man being beheaded. Catharsis. Feminist icon. The problem is that the identification is far less secure than the myth suggests. Holofernes is not painted like a private likeness. He is built like a type. Thick neck, heavy jaw, huge torso. A body made to stand for power rather than biography. What Artemisia painted was something more precise and more disturbing than a portrait of one man. She painted an archetype, the physical form of unchecked authority, the body that doesn't need a face because it could be any face. Now look at the painting, not at the figures, at the blood. Something is off about the blood. The spray coming from Holofernes' neck doesn't behave like blood in other Baroque paintings. In Caravaggio's version of the same scene, painted about 20 years earlier, the blood falls in flat, red ribbons. Theatrical, decorative. It works as a visual element. Artemisia's blood is doing something different. The streams arc outward in curves. They break apart mid-flight into separate droplets. At high magnification, those droplets are painted with raised impasto, thick, sculptural pigment that creates actual physical texture on the surface. You can almost feel the viscosity. This is not Baroque decoration. This is fluid dynamics. The blood is the loudest clue. The quietest one is on Judith's wrist. But let's stay with the blood for a moment. Because in 1996, David Topper and Cynthia Gillis made a strange and provocative argument about this painting. The blood, they wrote, does not merely splash, it travels. The jets curve through the air like projectiles, breaking into separate drops that look less like Baroque ornament and more like an experiment in motion, resembling the parabolic paths Galileo was describing in his work on moving bodies and the trajectories of projectiles. This is not a proven fact. It is a claim, carefully argued, sitting right on the edge of what the evidence allows. But it is enough to ask a difficult question. Why does the blood in a biblical miracle move like a physics demonstration? To understand why that matters, we have to leave the tent for a moment and go to Florence. Between 1614 and 1620, the years Artemisia was working on the Uffizi version, she had left Rome and its scandal behind. She moved to Florence under the patronage of Grand Duke Cosimo II de' Medici, who collected Caravaggism the way other rulers collected maps. She became the first woman admitted to the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno, the most prestigious art institution in Italy. And she became a close friend of Galileo Galilei. At that precise moment, Galileo was publishing the work that would eventually bring the Inquisition to his door. His laws of motion, his equations for how objects travel through space. The church was deeply uncomfortable. Formal pressure began in 1616, the same years Artemisia was finishing this canvas. If Topper and Gillis are right, and this is a hypothesis, not a certainty, and the distance between hypothesis and certainty is exactly where this story lives, then the painting is doing something almost impossible. It keeps the old religious story on the surface, while letting the new science leak through the wound. The surface says, faith triumphed. The blood asks different questions entirely. The sword guard gives the church its symbol. The blood gives Galileo his question. Now, the wrist. Look at Judith's left wrist, the one pressing down on Holofernes. In the chaos of the composition, it's easy to miss. There is a gold bracelet there, a cameo bracelet. One of the images on it appears to show Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt, chastity, and lethal self-defense. It is not a signature in ink. It is a signature by association. Artemis on Judith's wrist, Artemisia behind Judith's hand. The name is not written across the body, but placed exactly where the force of the painting begins, on the arm that holds the man down. And then, in the lower right corner of the canvas, almost perfectly camouflaged in the fringe of the mattress fabric, there is a Latin inscription. Ergo Artemitia Lomi Fec. Not Gentileschi. Lomi, the Florentine branch of her family. The name with no Roman scandal attached to it. A political choice, visible only to an educated Florentine eye. The strange word is not the name. It is the logic. Ergo. Therefore. As if the canvas is not an image, but the conclusion of a case. For a long time, the official explanation for this painting was trauma response, therapeutic act, a woman working through her pain. And there is, obviously, something true in that reading. The timing is not a coincidence. The first version of this composition was painted in Rome around 1612 and 1613, in the immediate aftermath of the trial. The physicality, the weight, the refusal to look away, carries biographical freight that is hard to dismiss. But I find myself unable to stop there. Caravaggio took a man's life in a street brawl in 1606. No one reduces his entire output to that event. No one says his paintings are primarily a trauma response to being a killer. He is treated as an intellectual, an innovator, an artist making deliberate choices about form and meaning. Artemisia deserves the same analysis. Mary Gerard, the art historian who has spent more of her career on this painting than perhaps anyone alive, argued in her 1989 monograph that the revenge reading is, in her words, reductive. Not because Artemisia wasn't angry, she almost certainly was, but because the painting is too precise, too layered, too intellectually dense to be explained by anger alone. Gerard sees something else, a woman constructing a careful argument about what female agency actually looks like, about what it costs, physically and emotionally, to be an active subject in history rather than a passive object of it. Look at Abra, the maidservant. In the biblical text, she is barely mentioned. In Caravaggio's version, she appears as a grinning old crone, a grotesque contrast to Judith's youth, a visual reminder that the real power here is supernatural, not physical. Artemisia made her young, strong, and completely committed. Her body functions as a mechanical counterweight, pinning Holofernes' arm through sheer gravitational force. This is not a miracle. This is two women doing a job that requires both of them. The tyrant doesn't fall to divine intervention. He falls to solidarity. In many earlier versions of this scene, there is still room for heaven, a beam of light, a prayerful gesture, a face turned upward, some signal that Judith is only the instrument of God, that the violence passes through her rather than originating in her. Artemisia nearly removes that protection entirely. No angel, no ecstasy, no divine glow. Just weight, pressure, muscle, blood, and two women who understand what the task requires. The one concession to theology is the sword. The hilt forms a precise cross at the exact center of the composition. The church gets its symbol. Everything else belongs to the body. After the trial in Rome, when Artemisia was subjected to the Sibyl, a torture device that bound and tightened cords around her fingers, used by the court to test the truthfulness of testimony, she said almost nothing during the procedure. What was recorded is that afterward, bleeding, she looked at her attacker and said, "These are the rings you gave me." The words of someone who had already decided what she was going to do next. The Medici paid her 50 scudi for this canvas, a figure that historians describe as insulting for a work of this scale and ambition. Caravaggio received multiples of that for comparable commissions. The payment was delayed by years. In 1635, 15 years after the canvas was finished, Artemisia wrote to Galileo asking him to use his influence with the court to finally release her fee. Galileo apparently tried. Whether it worked is unclear. This is the other documented intersection between them, and it is documented, which is more than can be said for the physics, not science, but money. Galileo functioning as an intermediary between a woman artist and the men who held her payment. That connection is in the letters. The connection inside the canvas, whether Galileo's equations shaped the arcs of blood, whether the two of them discussed the physics of motion in front of an unfinished painting. That connection lives in the gap between what we can prove and what the image seems to suggest. We will never know. The case Topper and Gillis made is argued, not settled. What the blood proves in the end is only itself, its weight, its texture, its stubborn refusal to behave decoratively, its insistence on being taken seriously as a physical event rather than a rhetorical one. Whether that refusal was deliberate or instinctive, whether Galileo was in the room or only in the correspondence, whether the physics was calculated or simply observed at the public executions Rome staged along the river, that gap will never close. The painting has survived 4 centuries. It survived being attributed to the wrong artist for 100 years. It survived being pushed into a back corridor because a noblewoman found it too disturbing. In 1993, a bomb placed by the Sicilian mafia detonated on the street outside the Uffizi, shattering windows and damaging works nearby. This canvas was among them. It was restored and returned to the wall. It is still here. The inscription at the bottom reads, "Ergo," therefore, as if what came before it was a logical proof, and the painting is its conclusion. What is the argument it concludes? Is it about one man, one trial, one crime? Or is Artemisia claiming something larger, that the old world, the one that tortured her fingers and shielded her attacker and paid her half what the men received, was already losing its grip? That the new science would outlast the old theology? That women whose testimony required physical proof were already writing their proof in a language the court could not read. If this is only a revenge painting, why does its most shocking detail behave less like rage and more like mathematics?